Ladies and gentlemen, today I invite you to step into the courtroom of ideas, not a courtroom bound by walls, judges, or wooden gavels, but one where the evidence of diplomacy is examined, where facts are placed on the stand, and where the credibility of leadership is weighed not by words alone, but by undeniable action. And standing in the center of this trial is one man, India's External Affairs Minister, who has reshaped global perception through his boldest move yet. The question before us is not whether this move was strategic, not whether it was calculated, but whether it was transformative. Was it the act of a diplomat merely defending his nation, or was it the statement of a statesman who has forever altered the balance of global conversations? To answer this, we must look at three powerful keynotes, three undeniable strands. For years, India's foreign policy carried a certain predictability. It was polite, careful, often cautious, sometimes too restrained for a nation of its size, strength, and aspirations. In the world's eyes, India was expected to defend itself when cornered, to justify its actions when questioned, and to quietly move on when overshadowed by louder voices. But in his boldest move yet, Jaishankar overturned this old pattern. He did something far more radical than simply defending India's choices. He placed India on the offensive, not through hostility, but through the sheer force of conviction and clarity. What once seemed like the voice of a participant now became the voice of a leader. And that shift, that transformation from defense to offense, is not just symbolic. It has changed the way the world talks to India. Consider what happens in the arena of global diplomacy. Powerful nations and blocs have long been accustomed to dictating terms, setting rules, and expecting others to comply without resistance. In this old order, India often found itself in a defensive posture, responding to accusations, explaining its decisions, or attempting to prove that its actions were consistent with international expectations. The subtle pressure was always there. India must prove itself before the world as though its sovereignty required global approval. But in his boldest moment, Jaishankar refused to play by those outdated rules. He decided that India would no longer answer accusations with apologies, but with assertions. No longer would it explain choices as if asking for permission. Instead, it would state decisions as rightful declarations. This reversal was most evident in the way he addressed criticisms about India's strategic independence. When questioned about why India makes decisions that sometimes diverge from Western preferences, his response was not defensive. He did not stumble into justifications about balancing needs or quietly sidestep the issue. Instead, he said, with piercing clarity, that India will act in accordance with its national interest and that it will not be apologetic for doing so. Those words carried a weight far beyond the immediate moment. They announced a new era where India was not a country seeking validation, but a country asserting its own authority. And that shift, subtle yet profound, changed the tone of every conversation that followed. Suddenly, nations realized that India could not be boxed into the corner of explain yourself. The tables had turned. The accusers had to justify their own positions. While India spoke with calm confidence, this transformation of posture, this boldness to move from defense to offense, was like a silent earthquake in the world of diplomacy. It forced everyone to re-examine how they approached India. Think of it as a courtroom. For years, India was like the defendant, constantly being cross-examined by powers who assumed authority over the narrative. But now, under Jaishankar's boldness, India no longer sat in the defendant's chair. India stood as the prosecutor, questioning the fairness of the system, demanding evidence, and turning scrutiny back on those who claimed moral superiority. This role reversal carried extraordinary power. It reminded the world that sovereignty is not something to be defended. It is something to be exercised. The strength of this move also lies in its consistency. Boldness without consistency is dismissed as rhetoric, but boldness repeated, reinforced, and multiplied across stages becomes a pattern the world must respect. Every time Jaishankar spoke, whether at international conferences, press briefings, or bilateral meetings, the tone remained the same. India will define its interests, and others must deal with it on those terms. It was not said with arrogance, but with precision, not with anger, but with unshakable calm. That calmness, in fact, made the boldness even sharper. Because when someone speaks with absolute composure, the confidence in their position becomes undeniable. What makes this shift revolutionary is not just how it changed external perceptions, but how it reshaped internal confidence. Millions of Indians for decades had carried within themselves a sense of pride waiting to be voiced. They had watched their country grow economically, technologically, and militarily, yet often wondered why its leaders seemed hesitant to project that confidence outward. But in his boldest move, Jaishankar did what the people had longed for. He gave voice to that pride on the world stage. He said out loud what Indians felt silently, that India is no longer a nation that must defend its right to rise. It is a nation that has already risen. The impact of this boldness reached far beyond the diplomatic table. It rippled through trade discussions, where India negotiated not as a desperate buyer, but as a decisive partner. It carried into strategic dialogues, where allies and competitors alike recognized that India would not be swayed by pressure, but only by mutual respect. It even altered military partnerships, where India now sets conditions instead of merely accepting them. In every arena, the offensive posture transformed India's position from participant to power. Critics may ask, was this not risky? Could such boldness alienate allies or provoke powerful adversaries? The answer is found in the evidence of results. Far from isolating India, this posture attracted greater respect. Nations began to engage with India not out of charity, but out of necessity, not because they were doing India a favor, but because they needed India's partnership. And why? Because boldness breeds credibility. A country that stands firm on its principles is seen as reliable. A leader who does not flinch under pressure is seen as trustworthy. In diplomacy, as in life, people trust those who know their own mind. Perhaps the greatest triumph of this move is psychological. For too long, global politics has operated under the assumption that smaller or developing nations must always explain themselves to larger powers. By flipping that assumption, Jaishankar shattered a mental barrier. He proved that dignity does not come from size alone, it comes from confidence. He reminded the world that a nation of 1.4 billion people, with a civilization spanning millennia, does not need to explain its existence or apologize for its ambitions. And so, when we look at this boldest move, the transformation from defense to offense, we see not just a tactic, but a turning point. We see a shift in the very grammar of diplomacy, where India speaks not as a subject, but as a sovereign, not as a respondent, but as a narrator. We see a nation finally stepping into the authority that was always its due. And the evidence is overwhelming. This was not merely a move for the moment. It was a declaration for the future. The most striking evidence of Jaishankar's boldest move yet comes from the way he confronted hypocrisy on the global stage. For decades, international diplomacy has been layered with selective morality, nations preaching principles to others that they themselves do not practice. It is the quiet arrogance of power telling others what they must do, while quietly reserving the right to ignore those very rules when convenient. Many countries have felt this imbalance, but very few have dared to call it out openly, fearing backlash, sanctions, or isolation. Yet Jaishankar did not merely whisper about it, he put it directly on trial. He exposed the contradictions in a manner so clear, so unapologetic, that the mask of self, righteousness worn by powerful nations, slipped for all to see. The evidence is abundant. Take, for instance, the debates surrounding energy security. When Europe faced shortages, it scrambled to secure energy from every possible source. Nuclear, fossil fuels, even coal plants that were supposed to be phased out. It justified these decisions in the name of national interest. Yet, when India pursued affordable energy deals to protect the needs of its people, the same nations that bent their rules turned around and criticized India. This is hypocrisy at its most glaring, and Jaishankar did not let it pass unchallenged. He pointed out, in precise and undeniable language, that nations cannot demand sacrifices from India while refusing to make sacrifices themselves. He reminded them that sovereignty means the right to choose, and that morality loses its weight when it is applied selectively. It was not just a rebuttal. It was cross-examination. Imagine a courtroom where one side constantly accuses another of wrongdoing while hiding its own record. Most defendants would quietly defend themselves, hoping to reduce the damage. But Jaishankar flipped the script. He became the prosecutor, asking, where were your principles when your own survival was at stake? Where was your restraint when your own interests were threatened? In doing so, he revealed that the accusations thrown at India were not about principles at all. They were about power. And once that truth was spoken aloud, the air in the courtroom of diplomacy shifted. The accusers no longer looked like moral guardians. They looked like hypocrites, unwilling to live by the rules, they demanded of others. This willingness to call out hypocrisy is perhaps the boldest aspect of his diplomacy, because it requires courage. It is easy to remain silent, to let powerful nations have their way, to avoid confrontation. That is the safer route, but safety does not create respect. By shining light on hypocrisy, Jaishankar risked criticism. He risked angering nations that are accustomed to unquestioned authority. Yet he did it anyway, not out of provocation, but out of commitment to truth. And truth, when spoken with clarity, has a power that no threat can silence. The effect was immediate and lasting. Suddenly, the tone of conversation shifted. Those who once lectured India with a sense of superiority began to hesitate. They realized that their words would not pass unchecked, that their moral postures would be tested against their own record. This forced a recalibration. Diplomacy became less about one-sided instructions and more about dialogue, and dialogue, by its very nature, implies equality. In that sense, calling out hypocrisy was not just about defending India's choices, it was about demanding respect. The boldness here lies in the dismantling of long-standing hierarchies. For years, certain voices in international forums were treated as dominant, while others were expected to remain submissive. But when hypocrisy is exposed, dominance crumbles. What remains is the undeniable fact that all nations act in their own interest, and therefore no nation has the right to shame another for doing the same. This simple yet profound truth, once spoken, leveled the playing field. And in leveling it, Jaishankar redefined how India is perceived, not as a student being lectured, but as a peer demanding fairness. The power of this move also resonates far beyond the walls of diplomatic halls. Ordinary citizens across the world saw in him a leader who dared to say what many already believed but could not voice. For people in smaller or developing nations, his words were a breath of validation. They had long suspected that lectures from the West were less about principle and more about convenience, but few leaders had ever said it openly. By calling out hypocrisy, Jaishankar did not just speak for India. He spoke for every nation tired of being judged by a double standard. Critics might argue that such boldness risks creating friction, that it could alienate partners or close doors to opportunities. But the truth is exactly the opposite. Respect grows when honesty is practiced. Hypocrisy, when left unchallenged, corrodes trust. But when it is exposed, even those who once practiced it are forced to engage more carefully, more respectfully. Indeed, what followed Jaishankar's boldest statements was not isolation, but deeper engagement. Countries realized that India could not be manipulated with empty rhetoric, and therefore real negotiation, based on mutual respect, became the only way forward. This courage to confront hypocrisy also has a deeper symbolic significance. It sends a message to every Indian citizen that their country will not be humiliated on the global stage, that their interests will not be sacrificed for the sake of appearances, that their dignity is as valuable as that of any other nation. That sense of pride, once ignited, becomes a force that fuels a nation's confidence in itself. For too long, citizens may have felt that the world treated India unfairly, that it judged India by harsher standards than others. But in Jaishankar's boldest move, they saw those standards being dismantled before their eyes. And that is why this keynote carries such weight. Because hypocrisy, when unchallenged, becomes the invisible chain that binds weaker nations. It creates the illusion that they must always justify themselves to the strong. But once that chain is broken, the illusion collapses. By calling out hypocrisy, Jaishankar did not just defend India in a single moment. He liberated India from a long-standing psychological trap. He shifted the balance of discourse so that India now speaks from a place of equality, even authority. In the courtroom of history, this will be remembered as more than just a diplomatic maneuver. It will be remembered as the moment when India's representative looked hypocrisy in the eye and refused to be silenced. It will be remembered as the moment when truth was spoken so clearly that even the powerful had to pause and reconsider their own actions. It will be remembered as the moment when India stopped being judged by others' standards and began setting its own. When examining the boldest move yet, one cannot ignore the most profound dimension, the redefinition of power itself. For centuries, power has been measured in terms of armies, weapons, money, or alliances. Nations have been ranked by the size of their military budgets, their nuclear arsenals, or their global financial reach. But in his boldest move, Jaishankar showed the world that true power is not merely the sum of material strength. It is the strength of principles, the unshakable will to act according to them, and the refusal to compromise on sovereignty no matter the pressure. By standing firm when others expected submission, he did not just represent India, he reshaped the very meaning of global influence. This becomes clear when we look at how India is often courted by powerful nations. They want India's partnership, but many also expect India to adjust itself to fit into their frameworks. The assumption has been that India will bend, that it will eventually trade its principles for temporary gains or external approval. Yet, in this boldest stance, Jaishankar declared with unmistakable clarity that India is not for sale, not for manipulation, not for compromise on its core interests. This declaration was not loud in tone, but it was thunderous in effect, because it said to the world, if you want India, you must engage with India as it is, not as you wish it to be. Consider the principle of sovereignty. Many nations, when pressured by sanctions, global opinion, or alliance politics, quietly adjust their positions to avoid confrontation. It is easier to bend than to break. But Jaishankar's move demonstrated the opposite. That it is better to risk disapproval than to surrender sovereignty. When asked to align unquestioningly with one bloc or another, India's message was clear: our choices will be guided not by pressure, but by principle, not by threats, but by needs, not by approval, but by our own judgment. In saying this, he redefined what it means to be powerful, because real power is not the ability to please everyone, it is the ability to stand alone when necessary. The boldness here lies not just in words, but in consistency. A1, time declaration of independence, could be dismissed as posturing, but repeated, reinforced, and made the cornerstone of every engagement. It became a doctrine. Every time Jaishankar spoke of India's right to make its own decisions, every time he rejected external lectures, every time he emphasized that dignity cannot be traded for deals, he was chiseling into the stone of history a new definition of strength. And this strength was not based on aggression, but on calm conviction. In a world where the loudest voices often get the most attention, he showed that firmness without noise is even more powerful. This redefinition of power carried ripples across the international system. Smaller nations, long pressured by powerful blocs, saw in India an example. They saw that it is possible to stand on principle and still command respect. They realized that independence is not weakness, it is strength. And when one country demonstrates this, others begin to follow. In that sense, Jaishankar's boldest move was not just about India's rise, it was about giving courage to the voiceless, reminding them that sovereignty is their greatest asset. But the redefinition also sent a clear signal to larger powers. It told them that India is not a pawn, not a side player in someone else's game. It is a player in its own right, with its own rules and its own non-negotiables. That message was not confrontational, it was principled. Yet principles, when firmly held, have the sharpness of steel. They force even the strongest to recalculate. For the first time, powers that assumed India would fall in line realized they had to negotiate on equal terms. And equality in negotiation is the true sign of influence. This boldness also touched the hearts of India's citizens. For decades, they had seen their country grow stronger internally, but often felt that externally it was treated unfairly, as though it needed permission to pursue its interests. But in this new stance, they saw dignity restored. They saw their representatives speaking with the authority of a nation that knows its worth. That sense of pride is immeasurable. Because when people believe their nation is respected abroad, they carry themselves with greater confidence at home. And that collective confidence becomes a force multiplier, fueling further growth, unity, and ambition. Of course, some critics may argue that principles alone cannot secure power, that hard strength, military and economic, remains the ultimate arbiter. And while that is true to an extent, Jaishankar's move shows that principles are what give hard power its legitimacy. Weapons may intimidate, but principles inspire. Wealth may attract, but principles sustain respect. Without principles, power is a hollow shell. With principles, even limited resources can command disproportionate influence. That is why his stance carries such weight. It is not about rejecting material strength. It is about anchoring it in something deeper, something that cannot be bought, bullied, or broken. Think of the courtroom analogy once again. If military and economic might are like the loud voices in the room, principles are the evidence. And in any trial, no matter how loud the arguments, the case is decided by the weight of evidence. By standing on principles, India brought evidence into the courtroom of world politics. evidence that it will not compromise dignity, that it will not exchange sovereignty for short-term gains, that it will remain consistent even when the pressure is immense, and that evidence cannot be dismissed. Perhaps the most important aspect of this redefinition is its permanence. Material power can fluctuate, economies rise and fall, militaries grow and decline. But principles, once established and proven, endure. By making principles the foundation of India's global stance, Jaishankar ensured that India's influence will outlast temporary shifts, because nations that stand on principle are remembered long after others fade. In the end, his boldest move was not a single act, but a reorientation of what it means to be powerful. It was the embedding of sovereignty, dignity, and independence in the very definition of influence. It told the world that India's strength is not just in its size, not just in its economy, not just in its military, but in its refusal to compromise on what matters most. And in doing so, he did not just represent India. He redefined the rules for everyone's of evidence that make his boldest move more than just a moment in foreign policy, but a turning point in history. Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence is before us. The three keynotes: turning defense into offense, challenging hypocrisy without fear, and redefining power through principles form a chain of proof that cannot be ignored. In the courtroom of history, where every statement is examined, every action is weighed, and every leader is judged, Jaishankar's boldest move yet will not be remembered as a passing episode. It will be remembered as the moment when India's voice shifted from echo to thunder. And the verdict, clear and unanimous: his boldest move was not just diplomacy, it was destiny.